Good afternoon, everyone. Very thankful that you all could join me once again. We left off in 1 Samuel 18 last time, where David he goes and cuts off 200 foreskins of the Philistines for to be given Saul's daughter Michal in marriage. Now, this roused up the Philistines. And not only that, they're riled up specifically against David. And this is where we pick up in 1 Samuel 19:1. This is really whenever Saul's madness escalates to the point where he no longer tries to hide it. You see, before this, he had tried to kill Jonathan, back whenever Jonathan gave, much like David, victory over the Philistines. Now, this decades earlier. David wasn't even born at the time, but Jonathan did that, and then Jonathan he partook of the honey and everything, and disobeyed Saul. And Saul wanted to kill Jonathan, but the people wanted Jonathan left alive. So Saul spared him because of the people. Now we're seeing that Saul is so unhinged, and his hatred for David has risen to such a peak where he no longer cares about the opinions of the people. He no longer cares. He just wants to kill him. And Saul spake to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. Well, first of all, that's an immediate sin. I can point that out right off the bat, because it is not simply killing David. It is murder. He is wanting to murder David. There is no justification for wanting David dead. And so he is asking his people to sin. God does not like leaders like this. Everyone wants to point to Romans 13, that chapter, where Paul is talking about showing subjugation to the governments of the world and the kings of the world and such, the leaders. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Read that chapter in its proper context. So many take this out of context and they say, well, look, Paul says we need to obey every government. What Paul is talking about are godly governments. God gives, he allows evil governments to be set up, sometimes judgments upon the nation and such. We see that in Israel later on, but it's for a bless or a test. So you're either blessed by a good government or you're tested by a bad government. Okay, so if Adolf Hitler were to come up to you and he said, you see this 2-year-old Jewish boy, put a bullet in his head, would you do it? Well, let's just say that Hitler brought a preacher or false prophet on out there and he said, read to him Romans 13, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. And actually, Hitler did take this stance, as did Stalin and all of them. Many have used this specific chapter that Paul wrote to the Romans. And they said, look, you have to obey us. God says that you have to obey us. What Paul is talking about is good, godly governments. The higher powers are viewed in Israel at the time of Peter and the apostles and Pentecost. They are viewed as the higher powers back then. But what kind of higher powers? Are they godly or are they evil? And they're trying to get Peter and the apostles to stop preaching. The high priest himself actually tells Peter and them, stop preaching this gospel. You're making us look like enemies of this Jesus and enemies of the people. And Peter tells him, he says, yeah, you are an enemy. You are the one that slew him. But he tells him, they say, stop preaching. And then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. To quickly summarize this, you could say, if it's a godly government, obey it. If what the government is telling you to do does not contradict what God is telling you to do, then do it with all your might. But if they tell you to do something ungodly and tell you to sin, as Saul is doing to his son Jonathan and to all of his guards, if they are telling you to sin, if these higher powers are telling you to sin, it is better to obey God than men. Do not sin for these people. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David, and Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father seeketh to kill thee. Now therefore I pray thee, take heed to thyself until the morning, and abide in a secret place, and hide thyself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where thou art, and I will commune with my father of thee, and what I see, that I will tell thee. So Jonathan is telling David, go out into this field, a certain field, and I'll bring my father on out there, and we'll talk. Many would also point to this as Jonathan's heart, once again, he's not only disobeying his father's command to sin, but he is also helping the man in whom he is trying to kill, because the man is godly. David is godly, and therefore he is doing the most godly thing. See, Jonathan could have went halfway in this and said, well, I'm not going to sin for my father and murdering David. But he says, I'm also not going to help David in this. That way God can protect him and whatever. No, he does the godly thing. And many would say, well, what about the commandment? Honor thy father and thy mother. It doesn't say obey thy father and thy mother. Now, it's an umbrella term. Honor is an umbrella term. Honor thy father and thy mother. Obedience is underneath that. But if obedience means sinning against God, then it's okay to disobey your father and mother. Don't dishonor them. Don't. What honor means is to do right by them, to not go out of your way to harm them or to harm the family name or to make them ashamed of you. You have to view such Bible verses as through the eyes of God and not through the eyes of ungodly men. And Jonathan spake good of David unto Saul his father, and said unto him, Let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he hath not sinned against thee, and because his works have been to thee word very good. For he did put his life in his hand, and slew the Philistine, and the Lord wrought a great salvation for all Israel. Thou sawest it, and didst rejoice. Wherefore then wilt thou sin against innocent blood, to slay David without a cause? They hated Christ without a cause. The very same attitude. A worldly man, expect them to hate you. Expect them to hate you. Now, they may not, but expect it. Because the closer you get to God, the more this world will hate you. They are not of God. And Saul hearkened unto the voice of Jonathan. And Saul sware, As the Lord liveth, he shall not be slain. I give far more credit to Jonathan in this than I do to Saul, but it does show a willingness to accept good advice by Saul. One has to admire at least that in him. Jesus said in Matthew 5:9, Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Jonathan is a peacemaker right here. And this is what God wants among men. Even among the ungodly, he wants us to have peace. If it's possible, live peaceably among all men. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan showed him all those things, and Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. So he brings David out of this hiding spot that he is in the field, and Saul is right there and had no idea that David was hiding, and he brings him on out, and they make peace. And there was war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines, and slew them with a great slaughter, and they fled from him. No doubt this was in retaliation of what David had already done to them. And Saul was, as we discussed in the previous Bible study, Saul was using this go out and get me 100 Philistine foreskins in order to make David a marked man among the Philistines and to hopefully have him die in battle at their hands. It even says that in the chapter Samuel, 1 Samuel 18. But it all backfires. And we see David goes out, meets them in the battlefield, very courageous, godly man, meets them in the battlefield and slaughters them. They flee from him in fear. All of a sudden, it's a two-pronged attack. The fear of David now settles within the Philistines. He's not only good on an offensive attack, but he's also good on a defensive attack. And so that now they're fearing him, and the people are loving him all the more because he is just a victor among Israel, one of the greatest victors of Israel ever. And the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul, and he as he sat in his house with his javelin in his hand, and David played with his hand. So Saul's sitting right there with a javelin, and David once again with a harp in his hand. David is praising God, bringing beautiful music into the room, and here we see Saul again with that javelin. And he's already made an oath. Jesus says, make no oath. This evil spirit, many would say, many would ask, why is this evil spirit from the Lord? Why is the Lord allowing the king to be so bothered by this evil thing? Well, you have to remember, Saul is a very proud, self centered man. He has great authority in the land of Israel. He has been very disobedient to God all of his days, and so much so that I believe that he reigned by fear, and God really doesn't like that. He's reigning by fear, even to the point where Samuel, God's own prophet, is afraid of him, afraid for his life. And now we see how David, the man of God, is afraid for his life. He's terrified. And no doubt, since this has already occurred twice, Saul has already attempted to pierce him with this javelin twice, or with a javelin. So David is on guard this time, and he is able to move much quicker this point. And Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with a javelin, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. And it is this verse right here that tells us about the very last moment that David would ever step foot into the palace in Israel until he becomes king. He is from now on a fugitive. Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. So, it's to the point where not only does Israel love David, not only does the staff members, and the higher ups within Israel love David, the city leaders, the elders, everybody loves David, but Saul's own children, Jonathan and Michal, loved David. And I think that part of it was that Saul seen why they loved him, and he knew that he was not as loved as David. He knew that David would make a more loving king. And after all these years of ruling by fear, all of a sudden he sees one who can rule by love, and he's furious at that. Much like Satan is with God, I believe that Satan knows that his followers don't love him. They may fear him, but they don't love him. God is loved. God is love. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So Michal led David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. We see Michal, real quick, doing exactly what a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cling unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh, meaning that all of a sudden the immediate family of the married couple is the married couple. It's no longer obedience. Obedience to your father and mother comes second to obedience to your spouse. So she is doing what is best for her husband and not for her father at this time. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster and covered it with a cloth. Now, this word bolster right here, just in case you're wondering, a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster, that means she was trying to make it look like his hair. Like he had real hair, because this image had no hair. And this image in the Hebrew is actually teraphim, which is teraphim, which is a false idol. And no wonder we see how later on Michal she is not spiritually on the same level as David. I believe the woman is pagan, pretty much. And it's amazing how David lived with this thing present. But of course, they hadn't been married very long. And also, she may have not have been worshiping it, but the fact that it's present in the room with them, I don't know, it just seems off to me. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. And Saul sent the messengers again to see David, saying, bring him up to me in the bed that I may slay him. His hatred has reached the point where he wants to do it himself. He no longer wants to just an assassin to do it. He actually, like a serial killer or a psychotic individual, he wants to see the life flow from David's eyes. And this is really, really sad. The deterioration of this old king, how he's become nothing but a psycho. And when the messengers were come in, behold, there was an image in the bed with a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster. And Saul said unto Michal, Why hast thou deceived me so, and sent away mine enemy, that he is escaped? And Michal answered Saul, He said unto me, Let me go. Why should I kill thee? So she's having to say something to Saul in order for, because she fears for her life too, as well. So David fled and escaped and came to Samuel to Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and dwelt in Naoth. Naoth would have been right up in here near Ramah. Some say it's within the land of, or it's close to Mizpah. But either way, it's believed that Naoth is in this area. And what Naoth is it's basically within this spot, it's a school for prophets, and Samuel is kind of the teacher of it. And David is doing the correct thing here. He's running to a godly man, and because he's got so many questions, and he really can't ask these questions of Jonathan, and because it would probably put Jonathan's life in danger at this point. He can't. He doesn't even have his wife to talk to. So who does he run to? The preacher, the prophet. Very good choice on David's part. The godly man will do that, and even the ungodly do that sometimes. And it was told Saul, saying, Behold, David is at Naoth in Ramah. And Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing as appointed over them, the Spirit of God was upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. This is a very unique way in order for God to protect David, in which I believe that was the main focus of the Spirit of the Lord coming upon these men. I believe that he was shining a light on them, and then they seen, oh yeah, and then they come to their own senses, and they say, oh yeah, that's right, David is a man of God. What are we doing trying to kill him? And then they begin praising God. And the reason why I believe this is the reason why I believe that their heart changes toward David is because they go back to Saul. That would have been a very dangerous move. They stop hunting David and they come back to Saul, and no doubt they're still prophesying because Saul knows about it because he does this 3 times. He sends, and all of them change. Their hearts change toward David. And when it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they prophesied likewise. And Saul sent messengers again, and the 3rd time, and they prophesied also. This is just the Spirit of the Lord coming upon these prophets, and very, very heavily as well. Not in the insane manner that you see in the churches nowadays. You do not see that. No, what this prophecy, I've done it before. It is a feeling of, and I'm certain that many of you have as well, but it's like that first initial feeling of being saved. And I remember I would just sit around and I would listen to godly music all the time, and I would just dance. I mean, you're just filled with joy, but not madness like in these churches where they collapse and fall over and all that. I give no validity to that, but I mean, I don't know, who am I to say what God does, but at the same time, it's a feeling of joy and praise and worship. It's a feeling of, and prophesying doesn't mean that you're sitting around telling the future. Prophesying can, as I've said in previous studies, it can be worship, it can be preaching. It's the Spirit of the Lord coming upon you. Prophesying is an umbrella word where, I mean, men do it all the time, and there's levels of this. There's the Elijah level, then whatever, David, Jeremiah, then there's all these, then it goes down into these other prophets not really known. Then went he also to Ramah, speaking of Saul, and came to a great well that is in Seku, and he asked and said, Where are Samuel and David? And one said, Behold, they be at Naoth and Ramah. And he went thither to Naoth and Ramah, and the Spirit of God was upon him also, and he went on and prophesied until he came to Naoth and Ramah. And he stripped off his clothes also, and prophesied before Samuel in like manner, and lay down naked all that day and all that night. Wherefore they say, Is Saul also among the prophets? So we're seeing now, there's a few things that I believe is happening right here. This is the last verse, so this is the last note. I believe that what's happening to Saul is God is first, he's reminding him because Saul, he was able to do this same type of thing, prophesying to the Lord in front of people whenever he first became king. Now he's at the end of his reign, and God is being merciful. He's saying, recall what happened to you back in the day. Recall what happened. Recall how you were so filled with joy. He said, now you are so far from me that you cannot, that you want to kill a man in whom is after my own heart. Also, it's a thing of mercy upon Saul. Instead of, sending a tornado down and letting it suck him up and tear him up to pieces and everything, hitting him with a lightning bolt or something, God sends his own spirit down upon him. It's a very merciful act by God, and it's a wake up call for Saul. He says, "What are you doing, Saul? What are you doing?" And after this display, we'll learn in the next chapter about how Jonathan believes that he has fully repented and no longer desires to kill David. David, he doesn't believe the same. David could have stayed in that area, but he wanted to, I believe, see whether it was a genuine repentance on Saul's part. Because David, he couldn't live there forever. He wanted to go back. He had to become king, and he still had to face his problems. And we'll learn about that in the next chapter. And David is not so convinced as Jonathan that this event will last. And it happens to an awful lot of people in church. They feel the spirit of the Lord, everything's all good, and they have those moments of clarity in the midst of it, and they start saying, "Oh yeah, why do I hate my neighbors so much? Why do I accuse them of such? Why do I look at them? Why do I not trust her?" I mean, it's you start looking at it very, very clearly, whatever problem that you have, and then you leave church and you go back out into the world, and instead of hanging on to that and staying in the spirit of the Lord, you go right back out into the same friends, the same people, same environment, and the same words you're using, the same curses, the same whatever, the same habits. You go right back into them, and then you lose it. And all of a sudden, and I'm not talking about your salvation, I'm just talking about this clarity that God's Spirit gives you. And you go right back into, and we all do it at times, if not a lot. But that is today's lesson. Tomorrow, Lord willing, we'll come to 1 Samuel 20. Until then, God of all peace, love, and mercy be with you. Amen.